Congressman, I would love to get your take and turn to things abroad and the situation specifically in the Middle East. Last month, the United States bombed multiple Iranian nuclear sites, involving us in a war between Iran and Israel. President Trump announced days after that the two countries reached a ceasefire agreement after a tumultuous 12 days of fighting. Now, President Trump says Iran wants to meet with the U.S. for talks. What do you make of where diplomacy now goes from here?
Look, I think diplomacy can succeed. I think it was important that the president secured a ceasefire agreement between the Israelis and the Iranians. And as I'm sure you know and your viewers know, the Trump administration was pursuing diplomacy with the Iranians before the decision to strike. I think it's wise, given how weakened the Iranians are, to try to reach an agreement to limit and make it impossible for them to obtain a nuclear weapon, which I think would be disastrous for our interest and for the region. And so I would urge any administration, I urge the last one, I urge this one, to try to reach a deal that can constrain the Iranians' ability to develop a nuclear weapon. We've got pretty clear data that when there was a nuclear agreement in place, the Iranians were enriching less uranium than they were able to enrich once the Trump administration took us out of the nuclear deal with the Iranians. That tells us that a deal with, I think, strict scrutiny and safeguards can work. The devil will be in the details, but I very much encourage this administration to get back to the negotiating table in diplomatic talks and try to hammer out a deal that can protect us and our interest in the region.
And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he touted the U.S. strikes as a historic victory that has already changed the face of the Middle East. What are your thoughts on that characterization?
Well, I think we've seen some jockeying back and forth from our own intelligence and defense community's assessment of the attacks. And as a member of the Armed Services Committee, as you can imagine, I won't get into the kinds of briefings I receive in those classified settings. But let's start with number one. I share the goal that the Iranians should not have a nuclear weapon, period. I'm also someone who believes deeply, and I've thought this whether there was a Democratic president or a Republican president, that we have seen presidents for too long ignore Congress's constitutional power here to decide whether we send Americans to war. And in my book, certainly sending Americans over the airspace of a foreign country and dropping bombs is the kind of conduct that only the Congress can authorize in this kind of strike. And so I've been disappointed to see this president do that. I've been disappointed in the past to see Democratic and Republican presidents ignore Congress. And I think Congress has to step in to assert its role and to frankly stand up for the American people who get to decide whether we send Americans into the hell of war, as I say. I'm a veteran of the war in Iraq. I know what it is to see our country deliberate and deliberate poorly, to be frank, as they did 20 plus years ago with the decision to invade Iraq.
And to that point, Congressman, after the U.S. struck the Iranian nuclear sites just a few weeks ago, there were real fears of a potential World War III, the United States entering another war in the Middle East. As someone who is a veteran, who was deployed to the Middle East, I mean, do you share those fears right now?
Yes, and I don't want to see us embroiled in another Middle Eastern war with who knows what timeline to end. So I'm glad to see that this ceasefire was brokered between the Israelis and the Iranians. I hope that it can hold. I hope that diplomacy can be successful with the Iranians to reach some agreement to block their development of a nuclear weapon and to give us some pretty strict safeguards in place. But certainly, I don't want to see young Americans fighting in another forever war in the Middle East. And I don't think that's a partisan position. I think if you ask veterans of my generation, Republican or Democrat, they tell you the same thing. They want our government to be much, much more careful about committing American lives and American treasure to fight. And I don't think it's in our interest to send Americans off to fight another war in the Middle East right now.